The step well in Tingra village does not hold water. It holds a countdown.
70 stone steps plunge into a pitch-black abyss, and at the bottom there's no liquid, only a number carved into the rock.
When that number belongs to a person, their own legs betray them.
They stand at the rim, their muscles locking, pulled by a voice that whispers from the dark.
Come, it is your turn. The villagers knew the price. Years ago,
a desperate ritual traded 70 lives for a promise of rain that never came. One name for every step.
One soul for every year of the drought. The village emptied as the well collected its due, year after year, name after name. I arrived in Tingra in 2019, carrying a camera and a notebook, convinced I was merely documenting folklore.
I did not realize that the count had reached 69. I did not realize that the 72nd step was not just a piece of rock,
but a waiting mouth. The well is not a ruin, it is an instrument.
And it had been waiting for a long time for the final piece of its architecture to arrive. So let's start story.
The bus engine sputtered and died at a desolate crossroads miles from any map. The driver did not even cut the ignition completely before he gestured toward the horizon where the village of Tingra sat under a bruised,
low-hanging sky. He refused to step out. He leaned across the gear shift, his knuckles white against the wheel. "Do not go near the well after sunset," he said.
His voice was thin, brittle. The well counts. It does not like to wait. I looked at the road.
Then at my camera bag, and laughed. It was a sharp, nervous sound that died quickly in the heavy air.
I stepped onto the gravel, and the bus door hissed shut behind me. The vehicle didn't linger. It lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of red dust that obscured my view until the engine roar faded into an absolute, ringing silence. I checked my light meter. The sun was still high enough to justify my skepticism. I adjusted my pack and started walking toward the cluster of gray, silent rooftops. I was a researcher. I had logic. I had a deadline. I told myself that folk tales were just stories people told to explain the wind, and I walked forward to prove it. The streets of Tingra were not paved. They were choked with dry silt and dead leaves that crunched like bone under my boots. Every house I passed was a hollow shell. Doorways leaned off their hinges, and windows were jagged gaps staring out at nothing. I checked my camera, hoping for a sharp image of the architecture, but the light was turning a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The silence here was thick, pressing against my eardrums with a weight that defied the open air. There were no birds, no insects. Nothing moved, yet I felt the prickle of a gaze between my shoulder blades. I stopped, turning slowly. But the alleyways remained empty. I walked for another 20 minutes, my footsteps sounding too loud, too intrusive. Just as I considered turning back to the road, a flicker caught my eye. It was not the dying sun. It was a rhythmic, golden pulse deep within the village center. I moved toward it, weaving through the skeletal remains of a barn. There, standing apart from the ruin, was a single house. A thin, gray thread of smoke climbed from its chimney, defying the stillness of the afternoon. The village was not dead. It was holding its breath, and that light was the only thing alive in the dark. I approached the house, the wood beneath my boots groaning in protest. The door stood slightly ajar, spilling a pool of amber light onto the dusty threshold. I knocked twice, my knuckles rapping against the dry timber, but no one answered. I pushed the door open. Inside, the heat hit me like a physical wall, thick with the scent of burnt sage and dry earth. An old woman sat on a low stool by the hearth, her face a map of deep, etched lines. She did not look up when I entered. She simply poked at the embers with a long, blackened stick, the sparks spiraling upward into the soot-stained rafters. I cleared my throat, ready to introduce myself as a researcher, but she spoke first. Her voice was a rasping, rhythmic grind. "Are you in the count, or are you just visiting?" She turned her head then, her eyes locking onto mine with a clarity that seemed to bypass my skin. I stood frozen, the rehearsed greeting dying on my tongue. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. I had expected a local villager, someone to provide context for my notes, but the weight of her stare made my professional curiosity wither. This was not a conversation. It was an interrogation. She did not wait for my answer. She gestured toward the wall, where the shadows stretched long and thin,
and began to speak. Her voice was the sound of dry leaves skittering over stone.
She told me of a drought that had lasted 7 years. The wells had turned to dust, the crops had blackened in the soil, and the cattle had died where they stood. Desperation had driven the villagers to the stepwell, not for water, but for a bargain. A traveler, a man who claimed to command the earth itself, appeared at the village gates. He offered a solution, but the cost was absolute.
He demanded 70 lives to satiate the dry ground, one for every step of the well, to be claimed in a cycle that would last 70 years.
The village elders had agreed, believing that after 70 years, the well would finally overflow. But the sorcerer had lied. The well did not fill with water. It filled with names. One by one, the villagers were pulled into the dark as the years ticked by. She pointed a gnarled finger at a stack of yellowed papers on the floor. Every year, the stone demanded its due,
she rasped, and every year the village grew quieter, until only the stones and the hunger remained. She let the silence stretch until it was heavy enough to crush. She shifted on the stool,
her joints popping like dry twigs, and looked at the fire again. The flames had dimmed, leaving the room in a flickering, uncertain gloom. She reached out, her finger tracing a jagged crack in the floorboards that pointed directly toward the door.
70 steps, 70 names, she whispered.
And the sound seemed to vibrate in my own chest. The cycle is nearly complete. Every year, the well took its due, and every year,
the village emptied a little more. She turned to me then, her gaze locking onto mine with the weight of a closing tomb.
There is only one step left, one name left. I felt the blood drain from my extremities, leaving my hands cold and shaking. The logic I had brought with me, the camera, the notes, the skepticism shattered. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, and pointed toward the window where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. "And you," she said, her voice dropping to a hollow,
final tone. "You arrived this morning. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was not the observer."
I was the final line in a ledger that had been waiting 70 years to be closed. I pushed past her and stumbled into the cooling air. The sky was bruising into deep purple, and the horizon felt like it was pressing down on my shoulders. Every muscle in my legs felt tight, coiled like wire, twitching with a rhythm that was not my own. I tried to walk away from the village center, but my gait was jerky, forced. My boots dragged against the packed dirt, leaving deep, parallel furrows. The air turned thick, smelling of ozone and stagnant dust, as if a storm were trapped just beneath the surface of the ground. I gripped the strap of my camera, my knuckles white, trying to tear my focus away from the path ahead. It was useless. The path seemed to tilt, funneling my momentum toward the stone structure in the distance. The well sat in the center of the clearing, a jagged tear in the landscape. My breathing turned shallow, ragged. I reached the perimeter of the well, and the ground vibrated under my feet, and the light vanished, replaced by a deep, suffocating gray. I took one step toward the ledge, then another. My legs were no longer mine to command. They were merely instruments of the stone. I crossed the threshold. The first step was slick with moisture that had no business being there, cold as ice against my soles. My legs descended with a rhythmic, mechanical precision that defied my own frantic attempts to stop. Each movement was a calculated drop into the dark. Below the surface, the air grew stagnant, tasting of dry earth and ancient, settled dust. I reached out to steady myself, and my fingers brushed against the interior wall. The stone was not smooth. It was a graveyard of jagged, uneven grooves. I felt the sharp bite of numbers etched deep into the rock. 1,903, 1,911, 1,948. Each carving felt like a puncture wound. The pressure in the air spiked, humming with a low-frequency vibration that rattled my teeth. I was sinking into a history that had consumed everyone before me. I counted the steps as I descended, each one a notch in a timeline of disappearances. The darkness was absolute, pressing against my eyes until I saw flashes of static. I reached the midway point, and the weight of those previous victims seemed to coil around my ankles, pulling me downward. There was no escape. There was only the descent, the cold stone, and the names that had come before.
I hit the final step, the bottom of the abyss. My legs locked into place, rigid and unyielding.
The silence here was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my eardrums. I reached out.
My palm flat against the cold, uneven stone wall, searching for a ledge, for a weapon, for anything solid.
The rock began to quiver. It started as a faint tremor, then escalated into a violent, rhythmic vibration that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest. I pulled my hand back, but the stone was already changing.
It felt soft, yielding like wet clay. A hairline fracture appeared in the center of the block,
glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence. Then the scraping began. It was the sound of metal on bone, a harsh,
screeching grind that echoed up the shaft. I watched, paralyzed, as the stone surface peeled back in thin,
curling strips. Deep, jagged letters formed in the rock,
biting into the material with impossible speed. I traced the strokes with my eyes. An R, an E, a S. It was not a date.
It was a name. My name. The final character finished, the stone hardened, and the vibration ceased.
The well was silent again, but the name was permanent, carved deep into the foundation of the dark. I scrambled out of that hole, lungs burning, feet clawing at the loose dirt. I ran until the firelight from the woman's hut flickered in the distance. I needed help. I needed someone to witness what I had seen. I burst through the door, shouting for her, but the hut was empty. The fire was dead, nothing but gray ash and cold stones. I tore through the room, desperate for a sign, a note, anything. I kicked over a wooden stool and saw it hidden beneath a pile of dry reeds. A photograph. It was sepia-toned, brittle, and dated 1949. The face in the image was identical to the one I had spoken to only hours ago. The ink on the back was faded, but the label was clear. The Final Guardian. The air left my chest. She had not been waiting for a researcher. She had been waiting for the final victim. Every word she spoke, every warning, had been a tether to pull me closer to the edge. My last hope for human intervention vanished. There was no one left in the village to call for. I was the final piece of a 70-year cycle, and I had walked into the trap with my eyes wide open.
My body betrayed me. I tried to turn toward the village exit, but my legs marched straight toward the well. I grabbed the doorframe, my fingernails digging into the wood until they bled. I screamed, but the sound was thin and distant. My own muscles were not mine anymore. They were pistons driven by the well, pulling me forward with hydraulic force. I dragged my heels into the dirt, creating deep, jagged furrows, but I was sliding inch by inch toward the stone abyss.
The sky turned a bruised, deep purple. The sun was seconds from vanishing. I lunged for a dead,
twisted tree near the well's perimeter, wrapping both arms around the rough, dry bark. I squeezed until my ribs ached, bracing my feet against a stone root. My legs strained, twitching, kicking,
trying to pry me away from the wood. I held on, gasping, eyes locked on the horizon. The last sliver of light touched the earth. I braced for the final pull, for the moment the well would claim its due.
Then the light died. The sun vanished. The tension in my legs snapped like a broken bowstring. I collapsed into the dirt, paralyzed, as the absolute darkness of night finally arrived. I did not wait for the sun to rise fully. I scrambled to the crossroads, my skin still raw from the dirt, my breathing ragged and shallow. Every rustle of the wind sounded like the well calling my name. When the headlights of the bus cut through the morning fog, I did not think. I lunged for the door. The driver did not ask why I was covered in grit or why my hands were shaking. He pulled away before I had even found a seat. I watched the village shrink into a dark, jagged smudge in the rear-view mirror until it disappeared entirely. Hours later, the city appeared concrete, glass, and the indifferent hum of traffic. I found a small apartment, locked the deadbolt, and sat on the floor for 3 days. I told myself it was over. I forced my mind to ignore the lingering ache in my legs, the phantom pull that remained in my joints like a dormant sickness. I bought new shoes. I started a job. I laughed at jokes that were not funny and drank coffee until my hands stopped vibrating. I convinced myself that the silence of the city was a shield. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt the cold stone of the well beneath my feet. It has been 7 years since I left Tingra, yet the distance is a lie. I live in the city, surrounded by the noise of millions, but the count never stopped. It simply changed its rhythm.
Every night my subconscious betrays me. I drift into sleep, and my legs, divorced from my will, begin their work. I wake up in the pitch-black hallway of my apartment, standing before the front door. My hand is always hovering inches from the handle, my fingers curled as if grasping for a latch that is not there. Each night, I wake up a little closer to the threshold.
The first month I woke up in my bed, the next in the living room. Now,
I wake up with my forehead pressed against the cold wood of the door, trembling. I have installed chains, locks,
and barriers, but they are paper against the weight of the well. The count is patient. It does not need to rush. I know how this ends. One night I will not wake up in my hallway. I will blink, and the city lights will vanish, replaced by the suffocating dampness of the stone.
I will be at the top of those 70 steps, and my legs will finally finish their journey for me.